2016. We, the core team, wish to thank each and every one of you for supporting us and faithfully coming even in the rain and cold. And even when the Cubs are playing and I hear it's 1-0 and they're in the second inning. Let us begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Lord, thank you so much for our faithful supporters. Bless them in numerous ways. Because we love you so much, Lord, we will all open our hearts, minds, and souls to your message this evening. In Jesus' name we pray. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Tonight's letter from Pope Francis is titled, Praise to You, My Lord. Tonight's presenter is our wonderful Father Kevin from Queens. I have to take the liberty and say some things about Father Kevin. He may not like this, but that's okay. I have broad shoulders. In 2016, he went on this 3-month sabbatical. Lots of people thought he'd never come back. While on sabbatical, he grew this thing on his face. Wow, that was awesome. Well, he did come back, but just recently went on another week retreat. You know, I thought you had 3 months of it. Next, he tells us he's going on a weekend hike with his friend. I'm really beginning to think he doesn't like us anymore at Queens. But that's okay. I'll let him talk tonight. Without further ado, Father Kevin.
Thank you. It's great to be with all of you tonight. And as Mary said, I'm pretty impressed at the size of the crowd, given the Cubs are playing and the rain is bad. So I'm glad that y'all are here. And I honestly, when I went on sabbatical and I grew that nasty beard, I couldn't wait to cut that thing off. So I for all you beard wearers, you have my great esteem. So tonight, I want to talk to you about the Holy Father's letter on care for our common home, or the Italian title is Laudato Si. And I have a plan for this evening because I'm all about structure. So this is what I want to do. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about the background information on the encyclical letter. Because, you know, what we have to remember is that encyclical letters don't happen in a vacuum. It's not like Pope Francis gets up one day and says, you know what? I think I'm going to write an encyclical letter, and I'm going to entitle it Laudato Si. There was a lot more going on there, and I want to share with you that background information to give you a little bit more understanding. Then secondly, I want to offer a brief description about the structure of the letter, because there's a very, very specific structure to his letter and what he has to say. And then the third part, I want to offer you some major points from each of the chapters, because he has some very, very profound things to say. My friends, please be clear. You got to be ready for some deep diving tonight. This is not simple information. And then I'll offer you a few personal thoughts and reflections, and then we'll finish up. And if you have any questions, or if you have anything that you want to offer, then we'll have a little bit of time for that. Okay? So far, so good? You ready to blast off? All right. Okay, so here's some background information. First of all, we need to dig around for the factors that influenced the Holy Father's reflections that motivated him to write this particular letter and what he wanted to accomplish. So first of all, we have to ask the question, what actually inspired Pope Francis to write this particular encyclical? And ultimately, it is the Canticle of Creation that was written by Saint Francis of Assisi. You know, and actually Saint Francis talks about Mother Earth. Praise be to you, Lord. And then he talks about Mother Earth, and he talks about Brother Sky and Sister Moon, and all these really, really lovely images of creation. And when Pope Francis got a hold and started to reflect on these different images, then he began to really, enter more deeply into the spirit of creation, and from that began to compose this document. So one of the things that we need to be thinking about, and you can go home and check it out yourself, is the Canticle of Creation by Saint Francis of Assisi. Secondly, the most influential factor in this particular document comes from a German philosopher whose name was Father Romano Guardini. Okay? Now, how many of you have heard about it's a true story. How many of you have ever heard of Romano Guardini? It's too bad because really, it's not too late. In the 1920s, he was really at the peak of Catholic intellectual thought at that time. And he was a great philosopher who spent a lot of time really examining creation, and was a highly respected cultural critic. Now, what's important here is a couple of things. First of all, in 1986, Jorge Mario Bergoglio began doctoral studies in Germany. Okay, and he was focusing his doctoral studies on the thought and teaching of Romano Guardini. Now, what you have to realize then is that Bergoglio's thinking was heavily shaped by Guardini's thinking. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about what Romano Guardini was thinking about. Now, this is important in order to understand Pope Francis. We have to understand Guardini. So to do that, we have to start with a series of essays that Guardini wrote in the 1920s. All right, hanging with me, Matt? I told you this was not going to be easy stuff. So the essays that he wrote were gathered into a book under the title Letters from Lake Como. Now, what we have to understand is that as he was growing up, and even into his adult years, Guardini loved the Italian countryside. He was actually German and grew up in Germany. He taught in a university in Mainz, Germany. But he loved the Italian countryside, and especially the lake region around Milan. And he was particularly enamored by the manner in which human beings, through their architecture and their craftsmanship, interacted respectfully with nature. He looked at the houses that they built, and he looked at their recreation. And what really captured his imagination is that the people were building houses and building cabins that were in alignment with the countryside, with the trees, and it was this really wonderful mosaic that they had created. But then by the 1920s, Guardini noticed a significant shift. And all of a sudden, homes were being built, and they were becoming larger, and more importantly, they became aggressive and indifferent to the environment. So all of a sudden, these people were building these huge homes that were just kind of like stuck on the countryside, or stuck on the mountain, or just kind of planted in the middle of trees. And so Guardini worried that the modern person was becoming self-absorbed, and the natural environment was something that humans were beginning to manipulate for their own purposes. And this is very, very important. And if you stop to think about it, 100 years later, because remember Guardini was writing in 1920, 100 years later, is he really that wrong? I think he was right on it. So it's against this Guardinian background that you and I can read Laudato Si, because so much of what Pope Francis has to write or has to say in this encyclical, you can read Guardini right on the page. It's an amazing, amazing thing. So keep that in mind as we go along with this. Pope Francis is deeply invested in recovering a sensibility to creation, to the cosmos, whereby we and our projects are are integrated with the world around us. In other words, he's deeply invested in helping us enter more deeply into a relationship with the environment. That we don't impose ourselves on the environment, but that we want to enter into a relationship with the environment. So those two things, Pope Francis' Canticle to Creation, and Romano Guardini and his understanding of and his love of the countryside and his understanding of the human person kind of imposing themselves on nature are really the two key ingredients that contribute largely to this document. So far, so good? You ready to go a little bit deeper? All right. So here we go, my friends. So let's talk a little bit about the about the structure of the document. So here are a couple interesting facts. First of all, in case you were wondering, it's about 40,700 words. I know, it was good reading though. It's interesting. This is the only social encyclical that's been written with a vernacular title. In other words, usually encyclicals will begin with a Latin title, but this one begins with an Italian title, Laudato Si. Most papal documents are addressed to the bishops of the church or to the lay faithful, Catholic lay faithful. But Pope Francis addresses his message to all people. He makes no distinction to his readers. He wants everyone to be able to read this, whether they're Muslim or Catholic or Lutheran or Anglican. It doesn't matter. The Pope states in Article 3 in this document his goal. He says, in this encyclical, I would like to enter into dialogue with all people about our common home. He's very, very intentional about that. So, and what's also interesting too is that this document comes about almost 20 years after the U.S. bishops identified 7 major themes of Catholic social teaching, and one of these themes was the care of creation. So even though in 1998 the bishops developed that theme, it was then about 16 years later that Laudato Si shows up on the scene. All right, he has a very, very particular concern for the poor, and in fact, if you read the document and you count them, he mentions the poor 61 times. It's interesting. He talks about poverty or talks about the poor 61 different times because he has a very, very particular focus on the poor. He also creates a sense of urgency in his letter because he uses the word crisis 28 different times. So as you're reading this, Joanne, you'll want to take a look and say, there's one, there's two, all right? So, but those are some interesting little tidbits. So here's the structure. Wow, I just dropped all of my papers. Oh, it's okay. Good recovery. So this is the structure that he chose. In chapter 1, he describes what's happening to the earth. And he's clearly aware of what's going on globally. He has a marvelous perspective and a very, very global perspective on the challenges that face all of creation. He's got some great advisors, and he's very, very aware. The second chapter, he provides a theological framework to have the conversation. And he asks some very, very important and some very, very interesting questions in that second chapter, and we're going to go back to those. In chapter 3, he talks about what humans have done to create the crisis. And he names 3 very, very specific actions or 3 very specific elements of this crisis. He talks about technology. He talks about the technocratic paradigm. And he talks about, are you ready for it? This is my favorite word for the day. Are you ready for it? He talks about anthropocentrism. Ah, yeah. For all of you Greek scholars, it's all about anthropocentrism. We're going to talk about anthropocentrism, so don't worry. Just hang on. I got you covered. And we're also going to talk about the technocratic paradigm. I won't leave you hanging, don't worry. And then in chapter 4, he talks about an integral ecology. In other words, what he says is that we're all part of a bigger picture. In other words, it's not just human beings that are the focal point of nature. He says we're all part, whether we're trees or, well, obviously we're not trees, but human beings, the trees, the rivers, the sea, the birds in the sky, the sun, the moon, it all fits together in a very, very integrated whole. And that's why he talks about the integrated ecology. And then in chapter 5, he talks about recommendations for appropriate approaches and actions to take. And he has a very, very heavy focus on dialogue. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And then in chapter 6, he comes to the conclusion of his document, and he talks about educating about the ecology and integrating spirituality. So that's kind of the makeup. Those 6 chapters are what he uses to explore this issue. Okay? So what I want to do at this point is I want to talk to you about the major points from each chapter. All right? This is where things are going to get a little heavy, but hang on. And if you have questions or if there's anybody who has anything they want to say, you just shout it out. Okay? And it'll be right on video. It's a beautiful thing. All right? So in chapter 1, he talks about what's happening to our common home, what's happening to the earth. And the very first thing, you're going to love this, the very first issue that Pope Francis talks about in Article 18 is the notion of rapidification, all right? Comes from a couple different words, and really the root word here is rapid. And this is what he says. He says, continued acceleration of changes affecting humanity and the planet, coupled with a more intensified pace of life and work, lead to rapidification. In other words, my friends, this is the easy way to understand this. Everything is speeding up. How many disagree? Nobody disagrees. I'm right there with you. But he says, the changes that affect humanity as a result of technology, and all those changes also affect the planet, and this intensified pace and rhythm that we experience every day, it all is coming to a head. And that's the word he uses to describe it, rapidification. He says the speed of human activity, and this is very interesting, the speed of human activity contrasts with the naturally slow pace of biological evolution. In other words, nature's moving pretty slow, but humanity is moving really fast. And so you can't have 2 different things moving at 2 different speeds. And what his issue is how are we going to bring a balance to both of those? And I couldn't help but think to myself, you always hear the term that Mother Church moves really slow. She is ultimately, interestingly enough, she is ultimately following the rhythm and the pace of nature. And that's what we need to be thinking about. Because people always want, the church needs to move faster, the church needs to speed up, the church needs to be more contemporary. The church doesn't move like that. It moves according to the evolution of nature. And so thought and truth evolve within the church according to the pace of biological evolution. He also says that the goals of rapid and constant change are not necessarily geared to the common good or to the integral or sustainable human development. In other words, just because we're moving fast doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's helpful, nor beneficial. And even more, he says it's not necessarily geared to the common good. It's not necessarily making us better. This rapidification, this intensity of pace isn't necessarily better for all of humanity. And it's not necessarily integral or sustainable for human development. Just because we're moving fast doesn't mean it's a good thing. You're all shaking your head. You're right on. So he has a very, very clear sense of this. He also talks about the the pollution and climate change that's taking place. There was a lot of criticism about this document because there's still a lot of contention about the whole notion of climate change. But he talks about, in a very particular way, he talks about the throwaway culture. And I'm going to read to you what he has to say as regards the throwaway culture. This is in Article 22. He says, let's see. Darn it. Okay. He says, a very solid scientific consensus indicates that we are presently witnessing a disturbing warning of the climatic system. In recent decades, this warming has been accompanied by a constant rise in the sea level and, it would appear, by an increase of extreme weather events, even if scientifically determinable cause cannot be assigned to each particular phenomenon. Humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this. He also, where did he say it? Oh, I've lost my place. This makes me sad. But at the end of the day, this is what he's talking about as regards to throwaway culture, is that we have gotten so used to consumable goods that everything is just easily tossed away. You know, actually, this is the quintessential example. Like, how many of you watch HGTV? Anybody watch HGTV? Yeah. So these folks, whether it's Flip or Flop, or whether it's Property Brothers, these folks go into these homes and they completely strip the house. But think about what they do is that they take everything in this house and they just throw it away, and then they bring in new stuff. And it's kind of metaphorical for how we live, because we just very easily toss things to the side. He also has a lot of things to say about water. And these are very important things. He says, access to safe, drinkable water is a basic and universal human right. It's huge, since it is essential to human survival and, as such, is a condition for the exercise of other human rights. In other words, we gotta have water if we're going to exercise our human rights. Because without water, we're not gonna live, and therefore we won't be able to do that. Our world has a grave social debt toward the poor who lack access to drinking water because they are denied the right to a life consistent with their inalienable dignity. In other words, everybody has the right to water. He also talks about the loss of biodiversity. In other words, the loss of forests and wetlands entails the loss of species which may constitute extremely important resources in the future. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, maybe you saw this, I saw an article about the fact that there was this particular species of tree frog that is gone. Oh no. The last tree frog, the last known, I know, it's very sad. The last known species of this particular tree frog is gone, and so it's now an extinct species. And so that's happening at a very, very rapid rate, as Pope Francis tells us. He says, caring for ecosystems demands foresightedness, since no one looking for quick and easy profit is truly interested in preservation. But the cost of damage caused by such selfish lack of concern is much greater than the economic benefits to be attained. Now, what's interesting here is that he's ultimately in this claim. He's ultimately making he's ultimately citing the reason why all of this stuff is happening. And what is it all about? One thing, it's all about money. That's what he's ultimately saying, is that we're very, very focused on economic gain, and the economic gain is really what's motivating us to use the resources that we do. He also talks about the decline in quality of human life and the breakdown of society. And what he's talking about here is he's talking about the unruly growth of cities He's talking about the effects in the around the globe. He's talking about the fact that media and the digital world are omnipresent. Everywhere you go around the globe, the media and the digital world are present. You're going to find cell phones. You're going to find tablets. You're going to find all of that wherever you go. Televisions, the whole deal. And he also makes this very, very interesting claim, which I think honestly is pretty accurate. He says this, and I'm going to find it this time. He says, he makes the claim that real relationships are replaced by electronics. He says, real relationships with others, with all the challenges they entail, now tend to be replaced by a type of internet communication which enables us to choose or eliminate relationships at whim, thus giving rise to a new type of contrived emotion which has more to do with devices and displays than with other people and with nature.
Amen to that.
Right on. So you know what? Actually, the biggest and most popular example of this would be what? Facebook.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's absolutely true. So all of these different things are in play. He's pretty clearly, and I think he's pretty accurately given us a clear picture of what our world looks like and the challenges that face us. And then in the second chapter, he talks about the gospel of creation. Ultimately, what he's doing here in the second chapter is that he is laying out a theological framework for us to consider the notion of creation and how God is so integral to creation. He talks about the biblical accounts. He says, the biblical tradition clearly shows that this renewal entails recovering and respecting the rhythms inscribed in nature by the hand of the Creator. So what he's saying here is that it was God's hand that put it all into motion. It was God's hand that created everything that you and I are a part of in the natural world. And it's returning to that. It's recovering and respecting those rhythms that are going to be essential to returning to that balance. He also talks about the mystery of the universe. The ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us. In other words, I am not the center of creation. We need to be constantly looking out. We need to be constantly focused on what's around us, not on what I want or what I think is good for me. He goes on to say that the message of each creature, he goes on to talk about the message of each creature in the harmony of creation. In other words, you, Sandra, me, Victoria, every one of us here, we are all part of the harmony of creation. We all have a place. Donnie, you have a place with your golf clubs. It's all part of a much, much bigger picture. And when we're all respecting one another, when we're all paying attention to the rhythms of creation, then we find the balance and the respect that we're really looking for. He talks about the universal communion. In other words, what's needed for a deep communion with the rest of creation, which is a really, really profound sense. And we're going to go back to that because he really addresses that in a very, very beautiful way at the end of his document. He also talks about the common destination of goods. In other words, the Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute. And this is very, very important. It's nice that we can own things, and we should own things. We have a right to own things, but it's not inalienable. In other words, you know what? If you, Cecilia, are living in opulence, if you have all kinds of stuff, and the person next to you is living in complete poverty, you have a moral obligation to offer them assistance. What is the great Bible story that we hear about that would exemplify this kind of thing? This kind of principle?
The-
We heard it just a couple weeks ago.
Yes, the man who's on the side of the road, he's Good Samaritan.
No, not the Good Samaritan. Lazarus. Remember Lazarus and the rich man and Lazarus? It's a great example. Remember, the rich man is feasting sumptuously every day. And this poor Lazarus is on the ground, right outside his home, and even the dogs are coming to lick his sores. So he had a moral obligation to take care of the rich man had a moral obligation to take care of poor Lazarus. So in other words, so he goes on to say, the Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable, and it has been and has stressed the social purpose of private property. All right? So in other words, we've got to share what we got. All right? So far, so good?
Yeah.
All right? I'm not losing you? Nobody falling asleep? Okay? Coffee can be served? All right. So he kind of finishes out chapter 2 with that whole notion of the social purpose of private property. In chapter 3, he goes on to talk about the human roots of the ecological crisis. And he names ultimately 3 human origins of this crisis. First of all, go figure, technology. He says, remember, in the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, we had the Industrial Revolution. He talks about the Industrial Revolution and how the human race we just really took off. But now the second part of it has now become technology, and he owns the fact that technology is not just about creativity, but it's also about power. He says this. He says technoscience can improve the quality of life, but it also gives us tremendous power. But this is the caveat. This is the caution that he throws out. He says, we can have the power, but we don't necessarily have the assurance that the power is going to be used wisely. That's the problem. We can have lots of power, we can have lots of knowledge, but how are we going to use it? Are we going to use it for our own gain? Or are we going to use it for the good of others? He says, an immense technological development has not been accompanied by development in human responsibility, values, or conscience. That's the problem. He also talks about as the second origin of this crisis, this ecological crisis. He talks about the globalization of the technocratic paradigm. In other words, this whole dependency on technology has spread around the globe. He says humanity employs technology in an undifferentiated and one-dimensional paradigm. In other words, how we approach technology, how we use technology in America, is how technology is being imposed in places like Micronesia, or Africa, or the Middle East, or the far reaches of the world, Papua New Guinea. And the problem here is that people in Papua New Guinea don't necessarily think and function in the same way that we Americans do, and we Americans don't function in the same way that the people in Papua New Guinea do. And so there's a problem. It's just one-dimensional. It's just a single way of using technology, which is not necessarily appropriate around the globe. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of proposition. So that's the second problem he cites. Is the globalization of the technocratic paradigm. But then he talks about the third part. Okay, are you ready for it? The crisis and effects of modern anthropocentrism. Okay? It comes from 2 words. First of all, anthropos, which is the Greek word for man. And centrism comes from the Latin word, which means to be center. So, in other words, anthropocentrism is making humankind the center of the universe. And he says there's a problem here, and I want to read this to you. because it's really, really powerful. He says, a misguided anthropocentrism leads to a misguided lifestyle. In the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, I noted that the practical relativism typical of our age is even more dangerous than doctrinal relativism. So relativism, he's going to explain it in just a second. He says this: when human beings place themselves at the center, anthropocentrism, right? Y'all get that? Okay. When human beings place themselves at the center, they give absolute priority to immediate convenience, and everything else becomes relative. Hence, we should not be surprised to find, in conjunction with the omnipresent technocratic paradigm and the cult of unlimited human power, the rise of relativism, which sees everything as irrelevant unless it serves one's own immediate interests. That's relativism. In other words, I am the author of what's true. If I think something is true, then it's true. If I think something is right, then it's right. There's no objectivity. It's what I determine to be correct and true. There's no absolute truth. All right? Does that make sense to you? So the problem here with where are my notes? The problem here with anthropocentrism is that when we focus on ourselves, when we make ourselves the center of the universe, then all of a sudden we, and that is each individual, becomes the determiner or the determinant of what's true and what's right. Does that make sense to you? And that's the problem. Because what is right? What is true? And that's why the church has always been grounded and rooted in the notion of absolute truth. That there are truths that are absolute, that are complete, that are whole, and that are unchanging. They are immutable. They don't ever change. And that's what combats this practical relativism. All right. So those three things, those are the roots of the ecological crisis, as Pope Francis lays it out. Technology, the technocratic paradigm, that we're just kind of imposing one-size-fits-all technology on the entire world, and then this whole notion that the human person is the center of everything. And then in chapter 4, he goes on, and he talks about an integral ecology. And this is, and I have to be honest with you, I was reading the first 3 chapters of this document, and I needed some medication. Because I was becoming so depressed. I mean, he just really lays out this pretty pessimistic view of the human condition in the 21st century. But then, once I started to read chapter 4 and chapter 5 and chapter 6, I didn't need the medication anymore. I just needed a good stiff drink. So, but in chapter 4, he talks about an integral ecology. And what he's saying here is this, is that ultimately, everything is interconnected. Everything is interconnected. Time and space are not dependent of one another. He goes on, because I think this is so integral or so essential. He says, it cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. Time and space are not independent of one another, and not even atoms or subatomic particles can be considered in isolation. Just as the different aspects of the planet, physical, chemical, and biological, are interrelated, so too living species are part of a network which we will fully explore and understand. That's huge. And that's what he's really getting at. He wants us to understand that it's not the human person that is at the center of the universe. What he's saying is that you and I are part of a much, much bigger interconnected picture. He goes on to say, we are faced not with 2 separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. So this interrelatedness, this quality of being interconnected, has, it has a pretty radical approach, or it has a pretty radical impact. So he's not talking about he's not just saying there's not just a crisis with society and with humankind, and then another crisis with the environment. He said the crisis is both, the social part of it and the environmental part of it are interrelated. He says strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. And he also talks, interestingly enough, he talks about this ecology between nature and humankind, but he also talks about a cultural ecology. In other words, we have to also be caring for the arts and for our history. It's not enough just for us to take care of nature and take care of human persons, but we also need to pay special attention to what he refers to as our patrimony, to the great priceless paintings that we've received from the masters over the years, these beautiful works of music, the opera, if you're a Grateful Dead fan, or whatever it might be. Just kidding. But all of those different arts and all that different history. We have a massive history, and we have to be willing to take care of that as well. He also goes on to talk, and I think this is beautiful. And again, this is such a far-reaching document because he's so inclusive. He says we also have to care for indigenous people. Have you ever thought about this? We have to care for the indigenous people. For example, the Native Americans. We ultimately here in America, we just took the Native Americans, we put them on reservations. We really need to care for we need to care for their spirituality, for their history, for their culture. Think about the Aborigines in Australia. We need to, and they're dying out. But we need to be willing to take care of them as well. And then he also talks about, interestingly enough, the ecology of daily life. In other words, he says we need to focus on the quality of human life. We need to be paying attention to the environments in which we live. We need to create environments, especially in the cities, that are welcoming, that provide people with spaces that encourage relationship, that provide a sense of security and stability. He pays particular attention to the notion of crowding, particularly in cities, and the need for urban planning. He talks about the need for our neighborhoods, and also, obviously, for adequate housing. And he also says something important about human life and moral law. And I want to read this to you because I think that this is also something very, very pivotal that he has to say. He says, human ecology also implies another profound reality, the relationship between human life and the moral law, which is inscribed in our nature and is necessary for the creation of a more dignified environment. Pope Benedict XVI spoke of an ecology of man based on the fact that man too has a nature and that he must respect, man too has a nature that he must respect, and that he cannot manipulate at will. This is a particular problem, especially in relationship to reproductive ethics. I want a baby, and so therefore I'm going to do whatever I need to do in order to affect that end. And so we manipulate we manipulate organs, we manipulate our bodies, we do lots and lots or we engage in lots and lots of behavior that is that's manipulative and not respectful of the human nature. It doesn't respect the gift that God has given us in our human personhood. He says the acceptance of our bodies as God's gift is vital for welcoming and accepting the entire world as a gift from the Father and our common home. Whereas thinking that we enjoy absolute power over our own bodies turns, often subtly, into thinking that we enjoy absolute power over creation. Learning to accept our body, to care for it, and to respect its fullest meaning is an essential element of any genuine human ecology. I know, that's very, very strong. But he's absolutely right. What's that? No French fries. You can't have French fries because that's not really respecting your body. All kinds of bad things are happening. I know, we're all in lots of trouble. So that's a very, very important principle that he has. He talks about, also in chapter 4, he also talks about the principle of the common good. Now, this is the definition he uses. He says, the common good is the sum of those conditions of the social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively, let's see, here I'm going to just read it from the, he says, here it is. The common good is the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. In other words, when we make choices, when we act, we have to be conscious of the impact that those choices have on the common good, on the larger group of people. Just because I think something is good for me may have some very, very radical impact on the common good. So he's very clear about that. In other words, we don't function in isolation. He also makes a distinction about the justice between generations. In a very simple way, he says this: we have to be thinking constantly, what kind of world are we leaving for future generations? That's a huge question. Your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren, what kind of world are we leaving them? Because we're going to be gone, but they're going to have to live with the choices we've made. He says something really, really lovely. He says this. Brace yourself. He says, doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony or disdain. We may well be leaving to coming generations debris, desolation, and filth. The pace of consumption, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes, such as those which even now periodically occur in different areas of the world. The effects of the present imbalance can only be reduced by our decisive action here and now. We need to reflect on our accountability before those who will have to endure the dire consequences. I know that at Queen of All Saints we've talked a lot about legacy, and my friends, here's a little preview. You're going to be hearing a lot about legacy in the next year. But what I want to say is that that's exactly what he's talking about, is what are we leaving behind? What are we leaving behind for our children, our grandchildren, or for even people that we don't even know? So that's how he concludes chapter 4. Are you still hanging with me? All right, I'm not boring you to tears? Okay, good. All right, and then chapter 5, we're not going to spend a lot of time on chapter 5, but I want you to notice something that he does. He's talking about lines of approach and action. And ultimately what he's doing is that he's identifying major paths of dialogue. He's really, really heavy into conversation. Different groups need to be having conversation about our integral ecology. In other words, he talks about dialogue on the environment in the international community. So the larger international community needs to be having conversations about that. Is that the G8? Is that the body? Yeah. The world leaders come together and have those conversations. He talks about the dialogue for new national and local policies, dialogue and transparency in decision making. In other words, he says, when we're having these conversations, when you're having, whether it's on a local level, a national level, an international level, we need to let people know what we're talking about. and what kind of decisions we're making, because it's going to have a bigger impact. He talks about politics and economy in dialogue for human fulfillment. In other words, we need to have conversations about the world politics and the world economy and how it's going to help people really flourish and become the people that God has called them to be. And then he also talks very, very clearly about the necessity for dialogue between religion and science. And those are the 5 major paths of dialogue that he identifies in chapter 5. And then he finishes up with chapter 6, and it kind of brings it all together. He does this really, really lovely thing. He talks about educational or ecological education and spirituality. So he says this: many things need to change, but it's we human beings above all who need to change. So we can talk about change all day long. We can say, you know what, these rivers need to be cleaned up, these streets need to be cleaned up, this pollution needs to be cleaned up. But at the end of the day, we have to be willing to undergo change ourselves. And that's ultimately the challenge. We have need for a new lifestyle. He says, we are obsessed with a consumerist lifestyle which only leads to violence and mutual destruction. And why is that? Because at the end of the day, we want what we want, and we're willing to destroy, or we're willing to denigrate in order to get what we want. Which is pretty true. I mean, if you look at it, it's pretty. He's right on the mark. Educating for the covenant between humanity and the environment is essential. He says environmental education should facilitate making the leap toward the transcendent, which gives ecological ethics its deepest meaning. It goes back to the theological framework that he created in chapter 2, because ultimately what he's saying is that we're never really going to be able to undergo this change. We're never really going to be able to have an interior change unless we develop an appreciation and a connection to the transcendent God who created all of these, who created this whole picture, who created all of nature and all of humanity. And then he puts his finger right in the wound, and he says that ultimately we need these are his words. We need an ecological conversion. He says the effects of their encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. In other words, if you have a relationship with Jesus, if you come to know him as the author of all creation, if you come to an awareness and appreciation of the reality of, or the redemptive nature of his sacrifice, that at the end of the day, when he died on the cross and when he rose from the dead, he redeemed all of not just humanity, but all of creation. And when we come to understand that reality, then we will come to change our position, we will come to change our understanding, we will come to change how we interact with all of creation. Not just human people, but with animals, with fish, with trees, with birds, with bees, with everything. It's an amazing, amazing thing. And it all comes as a result of that encounter with Jesus Christ. And he talks, and he gives qualities for ecological conversion. And I want to share them with you because they're really lovely. He says, this conversion calls for a number of attitudes which together foster a spirit of generous care, full of tenderness. First, it entails gratitude and a recognition that the world is God's loving gift and that we are called quietly to imitate his generosity in self-sacrifice and good works. Second, it also entails a loving awareness that we are not disconnected from the rest of creatures, but joined in a splendid universal communion. As believers, we do not look at the world from without, but from within, conscious of the bonds with which the Father has linked us to all beings. By developing our individual God-given capacities, an ecological conversion can inspire us to greater creativity and enthusiasm in resolving the world's problems and in offering ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable. And to be honest with you, he kind of concludes his document at that point. I mean, he goes on to make a few other points about the joy and peace that come from this ecological conversion. He says Christian spirituality proposes a growth marked by moderation and the capacity to be happy with little. It is a return to that simplicity which allows us to stop and appreciate the small things, to be grateful for the opportunities which life affords us, to be spiritually detached from what we possess, and not to succumb to sadness for what we lack. Interestingly enough, think about this. This goes back to the Guardinian problem. Remember, all these people come into the countryside and they're building these huge homes. In other words, they want more. And here's Francis, and he's saying, you know what? We need to be happy with a little, not a lot. Huge homes, not necessary. 6,500 square feet, not necessary. But we can be much happier with just a little bit. There's the Guardini there, and so there you see Guardini come alive right there. He says once we lose our humility and become enthralled with the possibility of limitless mastery over everything, we inevitably end up harming society and the environment. It is not easy to promote this kind of healthy humility or happy sobriety when we consider ourselves autonomous, when we exclude God from our lives or replace him with our own ego and think that our subjective feelings can define what is right and what is wrong. So again, this is kind of a review of everything that he's talked about. So I just want to, as kind of a conclusion, I just want to offer you a few little thoughts and reflections. First of all, I want you to understand that this document is not apocalyptic. In other words, it's not telling us that the world's going to come to an end. But what it does is that he offers a very, very serious call to reflect on our relationship with Mother Earth. And when I told you earlier, my visceral experience to reading this document is, there's a lot of sadness here. And it's true. If we really look at the condition of our world, and not in nature as much as humanity, we come to understand there's a lot of problems. How are we going to change that? So he's really calling us to reflect on our personal relationship with the earth, and more importantly, to become more aware of our relationship with our Lord, which then impacts everything else. It's also helped me personally to become much more aware of my use of ordinary things. For example, I was at Starbucks the other day, and so I just bought my usual 2-pump double tall non-fat no whip white mocha. But I was thinking about this for a minute, and it's like, okay, you know what? So what's going on here? So just in this 1 cup of coffee, I used and I threw away 1 cup, a lid, 2 wrappers from 2 Splendas that I put in there, of a wooden stirrer, the napkin that I used, not to mention the water, the coffee beans, the milk, and the electricity that were used to go into that coffee. And we haven't even talked about the human labor part of it. And all of that from just 1 small cup of coffee. And so when I think about it, okay, so if I had 1 of those every day, dang it, that's a lot. I know, not only am I broke, but it's also